Hello everyone, Taco here today, and we're going to be looking at the Pokemon Select Jazwares Cinderace figure. We'll be taking a closer look at the figure, and we're going to start off with the head. The detail on the head and the sculpting is pretty spot on to the actual Pokemon. The eyes and nose are also printed on pretty well. The proportion of the ears and the head are also pretty well balanced. Here on the back we have some of the copyright stuff, which is pretty well hidden, and overall the details of the head are pretty spot on. Now when it comes to the articulation, I think it has a pretty good range of motion when it comes to the head. It has pretty good side to side rotation. The head though does not rotate a full 360 degrees. The head also does have pretty decent front and back rotation. The head's movement going back is kind of hindered with the fur that's coming out of Cinderace's shoulders, so overall decent rotation for the head. Now moving on to the torso, overall the details on the torso are also really good. When it comes to the articulation at the torso, when it comes to the hip articulation for this figure, the figure cannot rotate left to right, but can only move up and down. I think for this figure particularly, that's a big missed opportunity. I feel like we should have had that movement to left to right as opposed to front and back, especially because this Pokemon is supposed to represent more of a soccer player, and giving that articulation would have given it more range of motion, allowing you to pose this Pokemon more dynamically in those soccer poses. So definitely a missed opportunity there. But when it comes to the arms have way more articulation than I think they need. The actual arms themselves can hinge up and down and rotate a full 360 degrees, so in that regard that range of motion is really well. The arm also has another point of articulation in its bicep area, which also rotates 360 degrees. And at first I thought this point of articulation wasn't really all that useful, but once I started to play around with it, I could see the uses for that point of articulation. I just do think I would have rather preferred this type of articulation in the hip. Then when it comes to the elbow, it can move forward and back, with the back rotation being limited as opposed to its front rotation, so that's always nice. Often figures will be able to bend forward and back equally when it comes to the elbow rotation, but in this case it doesn't. And the last bit of rotation is at its paws. The paws can move forward and back and could also rotate 360. This is another point of articulation which is welcome but kind of unnecessary, and I'd rather have the articulation again in the hips. But regardless of which, the arm overall does have really good range of motion when it comes to the articulation for this figure. Of course, the other arm is also the same way in terms of articulation, has the same points of articulation and same range of motion. Now moving down to the hips and legs of the figure, which overall have again a pretty good design to them. When it comes to the articulation at the legs, I do think it's a little bit left to be desired for. The legs have pretty okay forward and back movement, and when it comes to bending outward, it has almost little to no articulation that way. And considering that you probably want to pose this Pokemon in a kicking position, I definitely do think that that kind of range of motion is definitely needed. But I suppose some of it can be helped with the waist articulation that moves forward and back. But overall, the printing and the paint job on this figure is pretty well done. The sculpt of the tail is also molded onto its waist and has no articulation, which could have been a nice little added bonus, but again is not completely necessary. The detail on the feet are also pretty well done and pretty well molded. The ankle rotation is pretty limited, but not too bad, being able to move forward and back, but more forward than back, with very little side-to-side rotation, and that goes for both ankles. I think the most disappointing part when it comes to the articulation is when it comes to the knees. The knees, as knees typically do, move only back, but the range of motion moving back are super limited. The range of motion is mainly hindered by the fur surrounding its thigh, so because of that, the leg rotation at the knees can't move that far back. And this of course is the same on both legs. Overall, I do appreciate the articulation of the arms. I do wish though that that effort that was put into the arms was put more into the waist and the legs of this figure, mainly because I think this Pokemon specifically would have benefited off more if that articulation was in the legs, and that mainly comes down to this Pokemon being a soccer player, and soccer players primarily use their legs, so you'd want most of that range of motion being in the legs for this figure. So when it comes to the articulation, it's pretty decent. Like most Select figures, this figure of course also comes with a stand, and once you put the stand together, you attach it to its back, and the stand of course just allows this figure to stand on its own. Although I will say that most of these figures can stand on their own without the stand. The stand I think really does help it if you want to start posing the figure even more. This is just one of many poses that you could do with this figure, but again I do think that that leg articulation really hinders the amount of poses you can do. Now here's a 360 look at the Cinderace figure itself. The height of this figure is 17.5 centimeters and almost 7 inches tall. other Cinderace figure I could compare this one to, and it's the model kit version of the Cinderace. Both of them, when it comes to the design, are pretty spot on. Although the buildable Cinderace does have less articulation than the Pokemon Jazwares one, the range of motion and certain points of articulation are definitely much better than the Jazwares version. Specifically when it comes to the head, hip, and the knees. As you can see, the legs at the knee point can almost rotate to a 90-degree angle, and that's the kind of rotation that I think the Jazware version needs. So overall, the Cinderace figure is alright. I think when it comes to the shape of the Pokemon, it was definitely very spot on. They got all the details correct on this Pokemon. The printing and the paint job on this Pokemon were also really well done. The only thing that could have been done better with this specific figure is definitely the articulation. The arms are definitely the biggest highlight when it comes to the articulation, but I think that effort was definitely put in the wrong spot when it comes to the articulation. I definitely do think that the legs needed more of a range of motion as opposed to the arms. But if we kept the same amount of articulation in the arms and just improved on the articulation in the legs, then we would have had a fantastic figure overall. But because of that, it's just a decent figure. But for the price point of these figures, it's still a pretty decent figure. And oftentimes you could also find these figures on sale at Target anyways. So if you're a fan of Cinderace, I definitely still recommend getting this figure if you can. But that's all I really have to say about this figure. Leave a comment down below on what you guys think of this figure. Do you own this figure, or do you own any other Cinderace figure? Make sure to leave all your thoughts down below. Also make sure to leave a suggestion if there's any particular figure that you want to see reviewed. Leave a like, subscribe, and share this video with a friend, and I will see you all in the next one. Taco out.